It has been just over 5 months since George Floyd was killed during a fatal arrest in Minneapolis. His death, which was recorded on camera, and the video that went viral caused national outrage and triggered protests nearly worldwide. It also caused a racial reckoning that is slowly spreading in some parts of the country. A recent article in the Washington Post titled "Racism's Hidden Toll" takes an in-depth look at how Floyd's death may be forcing America to look within. It also suggests the, quote, physical and mental strain of a lifetime confronting racism surfaced in George Floyd's final years. The author of that article joins us now. Robert Samuels is a national political reporter for the Washington Post, and he wrote that piece. Robert, thanks so much for joining us. This was such a striking piece because I don't know that I had read a lot yet on what you term the physical and mental and emotional strain of years of systemic racism can have on black bodies. And you quote a friend of Floyd's who says that he had the opposite of a Napoleon complex. He was extra friendly so that people would not be intimidated by him. Explain that, unbundle that for people who might not understand what that language means, why black men in this country sometimes feel the need to shrink themselves or otherwise offset their stature or their behavior because of how they might be perceived.
Well, what a lot of young black boys learn when they're growing up is that as they come of age, people start to see them as a threat, that people look at them and they worry about whether or not they will attack them, whether or not they should be associated or stereotyped with people who might do nefarious things. For a person like George Floyd, who is very large at a very young age, his mother always emphasized that he needed to do as much as possible to make sure that people didn't see him as a threat. So you saw him, his family would say, if he walked into a room, he'd introduce himself to everybody. He tried to smile and make jokes, and he would always compliment people when he saw them to let people know that he was on their side and he wouldn't hurt them.
So in reading this article, I felt like this was, presenting the argument that systemic racism is a serious health threat to African Americans, and George Floyd is as perfect a case study as there is. And there was a few things that jumped out at me when you talked about how, at a young age, his knees hurt. So we're not just talking about sort of the stress. We're talking about the stress that can manifest itself in a very physical way, and of course a mental way as well. I just want to quickly sort of look at one of the paragraphs that you write about the impact of cortisol, which is what your body produces when it's under stress. Right. And if you have cortisol that is pumping through your system over a prolonged period of time, it makes you more susceptible to health problems. Can you talk more, just sort of draw that straight line between the physical impact of systemic racism? Because for the longest time, and you say in this article, you point out in the article, that a lot of the physical health issues that African Americans have dealt with, the argument has been, well, you make poor life choices. And I just think about what Jared Kushner said just yesterday about African Americans not wanting better. So, what are you going to do? There has been a focus on, individual choices, when really we're talking about a whole system that is detrimental to your health.
Right. One of the things that's really interesting about this scientific research is that we find these similar trends regardless of income, regardless of geography, regardless of education. But what scientists are beginning to see is that when you look in the body of African Americans, you see their baseline levels of stress hormones like cortisol higher than their white counterparts. Now, what we know about cortisol and those stress hormones, they're the things that trigger the flight or fight response, is that for a short period, they can be good for you. As reporters, they help us push through deadlines during the election. They can help you do tremendous feats during an athletic game. But if those levels remain high, if you're constantly stressed, then that wears down the immune system and it makes you susceptible to things like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, two of the three things George Floyd had. And what that tells us, and so what the science is saying, is that the daily stress of racism, dealing with things as small as microaggressions and potential racial profiling, to a fear that you might die at the hands of the police, to things like housing and wage disparities, creates this constant stress in your life. Now, for someone like George Floyd, who dealt with these systems from a very young age, one being told to fear the police who were an overwhelming presence in his neighborhood, being in an education system that pushed him towards sports and not towards study. And then when he gets that big scholarship, he has to leave college because he can't fully pass the classes. All those things built up in him. And so by the time the toxicology reports come, you see him with these very strong indicators of stress, things like heart disease, things like hypertension. And, we cannot ignore the coronavirus, which disproportionately affected Black people because they had to continue working in jobs that you could not work from home, which is the only type of job George Floyd could get due to his arrest record.
Right. And as Anne-Marie points out, Robert, Mr. Kushner there employing what is a racist stereotype, questioning whether Black Americans want to be successful, when in your reporting and in others it's been done going back to Ida B. Wells, points to exactly what you're talking about right now. And in fact, Mr. Kushner got into Harvard University because his parents donated a lot of money to that school. There's something interesting that you point out in your piece, too. And we're now revisiting the 1994 crime bill, which was passed under President Clinton, that contributed to mass incarceration. But as you point out, that initial bill also promised programs for rehabilitation that rarely materialized. So explain to our viewers what we were pitched in 1994 versus what we got.
Well, when people started talking about the crime bill, there were a host of social scientists who were just at the beginning of the research that we're seeing now that talk about the importance of being able to see a person's race and understanding the impact of the sort of choices it makes and the trajectory for their lives. So a lot of people who supported the crime bill said that if you're going to hire these police officers, if you're going to build these prisons, also please try to put in some money for job training, for research into why these communities are more prone to use drugs, and education, so people could prevent them. So in the crime bill, they promised to allocate about $6.1 billion toward treatment, education, and research. But here's what happened. They fully funded the money for prisons, and then they underfunded the money that was supposed to go to things like treatment and research. So, for example, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they were supposed to get $2.7 million. In 2001, we found a federal report that said that HUD never received the money. The Department of Justice, same sort of thing. They were supposed to get millions and billions of dollars to do these sorts of research programs. They only got 1.6. So what that shows us was something that social scientists talk about, that when it came to trying to treat the Black body, when it came to things like opioid addiction, when it came to the drug problem, which was a real crisis in the 80s and 90s, there was a tilt toward criminalizing Black people as opposed to treating them. Now, one of the comparisons we can make to this is what's happening now in the opioid crisis, right? When the image of the addict became the accidental addict, the suburban white woman, and then we saw this push not to criminalize, but to increase research. So what started at about $100 million in 2016 climbed up to $650 million in 2019. In that same period, they got about $3 billion for research with the current opioid crisis, which is known to ravage white suburban communities.
And that's what happens when you see an issue as a public health crisis. That is what might happen if you see racism as a type of pandemic or a public health crisis. Then these services that you talk about that were defunded, and we see it, not just with the crime bill, but we see it over and over again. There's always sort of a splashy debut of a program. It gets a lot of media attention, and then 7 or 8 months later, the funding runs out and it goes away. But if you see it as important for the health of the body, the black body, and therefore the body of this country, those programs would still be funded. And George Floyd had those issues. I mean, part of the reason that he moved is because he was trying to find an escape from the things that sort of what he had back at home that led him down a bad path. But he was looking for particular services, and you point out that he didn't find the services that he thought he was going to find.
Well, this is one of the things, this is a continual issue in this country, that when social services are promised to Black communities to be able to help them, and as sort of a way to sweeten the deal in terms of building up things like prisons and police, those things are not funded. So what we saw when George Floyd was growing up in Texas had, in the early 90s, decided that it was going to be the vanguard of drug treatment. And then they didn't fund the programs, particularly those that were supposed to happen in prison, when Governor Ann Richards said that the mantra should be rehabilitation, not incarceration. They continued to incarcerate. They did not try to rehab. And so by the time George Floyd comes of age, he comes back, he's having a hard time because he did not fulfill his dream of becoming a professional athlete. By the time he falls into addiction, there's no program to help him. The treatment centers in his neighborhood have been closed, and also in a state that didn't expand Medicaid, there was no place for him to go because he did not have a steady job and he did have an arrest record. So he did something bold, which is something that social scientists tell us Black people often feel they need to do to overcome some of their systemic challenges. He moves 1,000 miles to Minneapolis, where he goes to a drug treatment program that centers around helping Black men heal, one of the few in the country. And I've been there. And what you find is lots of people aren't from Minneapolis. They're from places like Houston and Chicago and other parts of the country, both red and blue states, where these sorts of programs are not available to them.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and so what happens toward the end is that there's an alarming rise in Black communities that's been previously unseen with the use of fentanyl, which is an opioid, that has sort of snuck into Black communities whilst all the attention has been placed on prescription drug use in white communities. And so what we see at the end of his life when we see those toxicology reports is something that is George Floyd falling into some of the pitfalls of another system, that a second opioid crisis was happening in this country and that people were not paying attention to it.
Robert, as someone who did a deep dive into George Floyd's life, and I want people to go and read your piece on in the Washington Post, Racism's Hidden Toll. It's a deep, very deep dive. It's long, but it's important for people to understand who George Floyd was. I think that even in the wake of his killing and all the protests that we saw that were happening around the world, very few people had an understanding of who he was, the life that he led, the man behind that 8-minute, 9-minute video that we all saw. And that's what you do with your reporting here. So if you had to distill for our viewers, what is perhaps the most common misconception people have for George Floyd, for the people who may have been outraged, rightfully so, by the video, but don't know a lot about him, for the people who may know a few snippets of what they know about him, that perhaps he had a drug addiction, or perhaps he was doing something that he shouldn't have been doing, and that's all they know. What would you want people to know about the life of George Floyd and why his life, just like all of our lives here in this country and around the world, matters?
One thing that struck out to me, more so than anything else that I've read when you speak to people who knew and loved George Floyd, uh, is that George Floyd kept trying, and that he had this dream in life, first to be a Supreme Court justice, then to be an athlete. And over time, because he was not equipped with the resources and the support in this country, those dreams diminished. By the end of his life, he just wanted to be a truck driver. But what people say is that even when he was going through the throes of addiction, he kept on trying to seek help, and he was trying to seek help again until he contracted the coronavirus. And I thought that really spoke volumes to the type of person he was. That, a lot of people, before they read the piece, they might have thought he was just some drug addict who wasn't trying. He was trying. And the second thing that I think is really important to note is that George Floyd's mother, Larcinia, when she was growing up, she would tell him, "You're already born with two strikes. You're black and you're male." And to me, that contrasted with another person from Texas, who was George W. Bush, who, by his own admission, had a struggle with alcohol. He never said he was an alcoholic, but his friend said that he had trouble drinking, and that George Bush, he relied on his support system and his faith to be able to stop drinking, to attain sobriety. At the end of his life, George Floyd was doing the same thing. The last written notes that we found from him were motivations to himself, saying, "Let this be the day that I can overcome this dark situation through the Holy Spirit." And so I think one of the ways to think about George Floyd is to note that he was trying to deal with his substance use issue in the same way a former president of the United States was.
Oh, I love that. Those are great lasting words to sort of end this interview with. Robert Samuels, once again, you write for the Washington Post. I encourage people to seek out this article. It is lengthy, it is detailed, and it does sort of breathe life into, a name that many people know now and many people have been inspired by. But I think you'll be even more moved when you really know about his personal journey and his personal challenges. Robert Samuels, thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. It was a pleasure.